I never thought I would end up in a place like this. The walls around me were pale and lifeless, the kind of sterile white that drains warmth out of your bones. The faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead echoed against the silence, and the air carried that unmistakable scent of antiseptic mixed with loneliness. A nursing home. A place people are tucked away when the world decides they've served their purpose. And me. I was supposed to be enjoying the twilight of my life in the comfort of the house I built with my own 2 hands. A house that wasn't just brick and wood, but memories carved into every corner. The roses I planted by the porch, the kitchen where I fed my babies, the living room where birthdays were celebrated, and where laughter once bounced against the walls. That house was worth $1.8 million. But to me it wasn't about the price. It was priceless. My soul lived in its walls. And yet, here I was, stripped of it all. Do you want to know why? Because of my son. My own flesh and blood. He was a lawyer, sharp-tongued and quick-witted. A man who prided himself on never losing a case. People admired him, called him brilliant, said he could find a loophole in anything. But behind that polished smile and expensive suit, he was something else, greedy, cold, calculated. And I'll tell you something. I should have seen it coming. He came to me weeks earlier, dressed neatly as always, holding a stack of papers. His tone was sweet, almost too sweet. "Mom," he said, "this is just for protection. With your age, you don't want legal troubles if anything happens. Let me manage things for you. It's safer." I remember looking at him, my heart swelling with pride and trust. This was the boy I raised, the one who held my hand when his father passed away. The one I worked myself to the bone for so he could go to law school. He had become someone important, someone respected. And when he looked me in the eye and said he'd take care of me, I believed him. I didn't read the papers closely. I'll admit that. My eyes aren't what they used to be. I just trusted his voice. Sign. And with that signature I thought I was ensuring my safety. But what I really did was hand him the keys to my life. It wasn't until later that I realized he had sold my home. Just like that. My neighbors called me in shock. "We saw strangers looking through the house today. What's going on?" I didn't even know. My son never told me. The night I confronted him, his eyes were cold, his jaw firm. "Mom," he said flatly, "it's better this way. You can't keep up with a big house anymore. You'll be safer in a facility where they can watch over you. This isn't up for discussion." Safer. That was his excuse. But it wasn't safety he cared about. It was money. Always money. Within days, I was moved out of my home and into this place, like baggage shoved in a corner. I still remember the way my daughter-in-law smirked as she closed the door of my old house behind her, keys dangling in her hand like a trophy. They thought they won. They thought the old woman was done. But what they didn't know was that I was smiling too. Because while they believed they'd outsmarted me, they overlooked one crucial detail. You see, my son was clever. But clever people often become arrogant. They get sloppy. They think they're untouchable. And me. I may be old, but I've lived long enough to know that arrogance leaves cracks in even the strongest walls. Cracks wide enough for someone like me to slip through. So I sat here, in this cold little room, silent. I let them believe I was beaten. But inside, my mind was sharper than ever. I remembered the papers I signed. I remembered exactly where I hesitated with the pen, the line I questioned but didn't cross. And in that tiny hesitation, in that one detail my son overlooked, lay my salvation. It was the kind of thing a lawyer like him should have caught. But he didn't. And that would be his undoing. One night, as the clock ticked toward midnight, I reached for the phone by my bed. My hands trembled, but not from weakness, from anticipation. I dialed a number I hadn't called in years. A voice answered, warm and steady. "Hello. This is Judge Whitmore speaking." I smiled for the first time in weeks. "It's me," I whispered. "And I need your help. Before I tell you how I brought my son's world crashing down, you need to understand how we got here. Because stories like this don't start with a single act of betrayal. They begin years earlier, quietly, like cracks in a wall you don't notice until the whole thing caves in. When I was younger, life was never easy. My husband and I weren't rich. We didn't have millions sitting in the bank or fancy vacations lined up every summer. What we had was grit. He worked long hours as a mechanic, and I worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. There were nights I'd fall asleep with aching feet, my hands raw from scrubbing, but I'd look over at my children sleeping peacefully, and I'd tell myself, this is worth it. This is what mothers are made for. My son, the very same boy who would one day sell my home out from under me, was once my greatest joy. I still remember holding him for the first time. He had this tiny curl of dark hair, and he squeezed my finger like he already knew I was his safe place. From that day forward, I lived for him. We didn't have money, but I made sure he never felt the difference. If his shoes wore thin, I'd patch them up or skip a meal myself to buy him new ones. If he wanted books, I'd scour yard sales and thrift shops until I found them. And when he said he wanted to be a lawyer, I told him, "Son, you can be anything you dream of. I'll find a way." And I did. Lord knows how I scraped it together, but I paid for his schooling. I took extra shifts, pawned jewelry, cut back on everything. There were winters when I wore the same coat until the fabric thinned, but he had what he needed. I remember one particular night. It's burned into my memory. He was in high school then, working on a debate competition. I stayed up with him until dawn, sitting at the kitchen table as he practiced his arguments. His eyes were bright, his words sharp, and even then I could see it. He had a gift. He was destined to be someone important. When he won that competition, he hugged me so tight I thought my ribs would crack. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mom," he whispered. And I believed him. So when the acceptance letter for law school came, I cried tears of pride. We threw a celebration, though it was nothing fancy, just homemade cake and candles. I still remember the way he looked at me across that table. His smile wide. His eyes full of ambition. "I'll take care of you one day, Mom. You won't have to worry about anything." Those words, they stayed with me. I carried them like a promise, a warm blanket I wrapped around myself on the hardest days. But promises, I learned, are fragile things. See, as he grew older, something in him began to change. First, it was subtle. He came home from college talking about classmates with rich parents, how they lived in condos and drove new cars while I still drove the same beat-up station wagon. He'd laugh about it, but I caught the bitterness underneath. Then he started dressing differently, suits and ties, even when it wasn't necessary. He spoke differently too, sharper, colder, as though each word was measured to make himself seem bigger. And money. Oh, money became his obsession. Everything was about it. He'd brag about the cases he won, the clients he tricked into settlements, the fees he collected. When he visited, it was less about family and more about flaunting his success. He'd toss his keys onto my kitchen counter, the logo of his luxury car shining in the light, just so I wouldn't miss it. At first I told myself this was just ambition, that he was proud of how far he'd come. I wanted to believe that underneath the polished shell, my boy was still there. The one who used to fall asleep on my lap, the one who promised he'd care for me. But slowly the cracks widened. I'll never forget the day he scolded me for refusing to sell the house. He walked through the front door, looked around the living room and said, "Mom, this place is outdated. You're sitting on money and doing nothing with it. You should sell and invest before it loses value." I was stunned. That house wasn't just property. It was the place where I raised him, where his father and I built a life. It was my anchor. I told him as much, but he just rolled his eyes. "You're being sentimental. Houses are assets, not shrines. You're wasting potential." Wasting potential. That's how he saw it. Not as the home that sheltered him, but as dollar signs waiting to be cashed in. And then came his wife. Lord, she was a piece of work. Polished, sharp, with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. From the very beginning, she looked at me as if I were a burden, an obstacle standing in the way of her perfect life. I tried to welcome her. I cooked her favorite meals, invited her to sit with me for tea, tried to open my heart. But her words were like knives coated in sugar. "Oh, you still live here," she'd say, glancing around the house. "It's cozy. But don't you think it's too much for someone your age?" I knew what she meant. Too much house for me, but just enough house for them. It was around that time that I started noticing the whispers between them. Quick exchanges when they thought I wasn't listening. Phone calls that ended abruptly when I walked into the room. Documents slipped into folders, tucked away the moment I entered. Still, I told myself, they're family. They wouldn't hurt me. Not my own son. But family, I've learned, isn't just about blood. It's about loyalty. And loyalty was something they no longer had for me. Looking back, I see it clearly now, the setup, the planning, the way they softened me up with false concern. "Mom, you shouldn't stress about bills. We'll help. Mom, managing the house is too much for you. Mom, we just want what's best." What's best? Those two words are poison when spoken by greedy mouths. And yet I wanted to believe them. Because hope is stubborn, and a mother's love even more so. Even as doubt gnawed at me, I clung to the memory of that boy at the kitchen table, promising me I'd never have to worry. I couldn't see then that the boy I raised was long gone, replaced by a man who valued money more than blood. You know, betrayal doesn't come in a loud crash. It doesn't scream at you from the start. It comes softly, disguised as care, as kindness, until you're too deep to crawl out. Began with papers. Always papers. My son started bringing me documents to review. He'd say things like, "Mom, this is just to make sure your finances are secure." Or, "Mom, I want to take some of this stress off your shoulders. Let me handle the details." He'd slide the papers across the table and I'd sign, trusting him. After all, he was my son. Lawyer. The boy I raised. Who better to protect me? What I didn't realize was that each signature chipped away at my security. Each stroke of the pen shifted more control from my hands into his. And I, blinded by trust, handed him the keys to my own downfall. One day, he came by with a particularly thick folder. He poured me tea, sat me down, and smiled that polished smile he always wore when he wanted something. "Mom," he began gently, "this house is too much for you. We've talked about it. You need less stress, less responsibility. You deserve comfort." I shook my head. I told him I loved my home. That every wall held memories. That every corner carried the weight of a life built with sweat and sacrifice. But he wouldn't hear it. "It's not safe for you anymore. The stairs, the upkeep. You could fall, you could hurt yourself. What if something happened while you were alone?" His words pressed on my heart like a heavy stone. Because deep down I feared those very things. Aging has a way of reminding you of your fragility. My knees weren't what they used to be. My back ached. Some nights, I'd catch myself gripping the railing tighter than before. But still, it was my home. He must have seen the hesitation in my eyes, because he leaned in closer, lowering his voice like he was soothing a frightened child. "Mom, trust me. I'll handle everything. We'll sell the house and you'll be set. You won't have to lift a finger. Just relax. Let me do this for you." I wanted to believe him. My heart wanted to. But something inside me, a whisper, a quiet unease, told me this wasn't about me. It was about him. I asked him, "What about the money? What will happen to it?" He didn't even blink. "Mom, it'll go into investments, into accounts I'll manage. You'll never worry about a thing." Accounts he would manage. Money he would control. Still, I was tired. Worn down. And I wanted to believe my boy wouldn't betray me. So I signed. Days later, the for sale sign appeared on my front lawn. My stomach dropped when I saw it. Strangers walked through my halls, opening cabinets, whispering about renovations, pointing out flaws in the house I had loved for decades. And through it all, my son smiled, shaking hands, making deals. Sold quickly, too quickly. $1.8 million. My life's worth, neatly tied up in a number. And then came the next blow. I expected some of that money to be put aside for me. Enough to keep me secure, independent. But instead, my son came to me with another plan. "Mom, the money's being reinvested. It's better this way. Trust me. For now, we've arranged for you to stay somewhere safe. Somewhere you'll be cared for." I frowned. "What do you mean, somewhere else?" That's when he said it, casual, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "A nursing home, Mom. It's comfortable, professional. You'll love it." My heart stopped. A nursing home. The word rang in my ears like a curse. Not because there's shame in needing care, but because I wasn't ready. I wasn't helpless. And more than that, I never imagined my son would push me away so easily. I told him no. I told him I could manage, that I'd hire help if needed. I begged him to let me stay in my own space, to give me just a little more time. But he shook his head. "Mom, this is what's best. You'll see. It's best." Always those words. And then, without my consent, the arrangements were made. Boxes packed. Movers hired. My belongings, my life, reduced to what could fit in a few cartons. The day they drove me to the nursing home, I sat in the back seat in silence, my hands trembling in my lap. Outside the window, the city blurred, each street pulling me further from the life I had known. When we arrived, the place looked clean, polished, almost like a hotel. But the walls smelled of antiseptic. The air was thick with quiet sorrow, with the weight of people who had been left behind. A cheerful nurse greeted me, but her smile couldn't mask the truth. This wasn't home. It was a cage with soft cushions. My son kissed my cheek, told me I'd thank him one day, and left. That night, I sat on the narrow bed, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, and for the first time in years I cried. Not the quiet tears of a woman hiding her pain, but deep, racking sobs that shook my chest. Because I finally saw it clearly. My son hadn't saved me. He hadn't protected me. He had taken everything, my home, my freedom, my dignity, and locked me away. And worst of all, he thought he had won. But what he didn't know was that his clever lawyer's mind had missed one small, devastating detail. You know, when you're old, people assume you're blind to the world. They think you can't read fine print, that you can't notice the details, that your mind is too foggy to keep up. But let me tell you something. Age doesn't dull wisdom. If anything, it sharpens it. You've seen enough lies, enough tricks, to recognize the patterns. And though my son thought he was clever, the sharp lawyer, the man with all the answers, he forgot who raised him. He forgot I was no fool. That night in the nursing home, I couldn't sleep. The walls felt too close, the sheets too stiff. I lay awake, my mind replaying every word, every paper, every signature he'd pushed across the table. And then it struck me, a memory as clear as sunlight. One afternoon months before, he'd been rushing. He had a pile of documents, and in his hurry to convince me, he had overlooked one little clause. One tiny section he never explained. At the time, I didn't think much of it. But now, in that sterile room, the memory returned like a gift from fate. I had insisted, stubborn as I was, that certain assets remain in my name. Not for control, but for sentimental reasons. And he'd agreed, distracted, probably thinking it didn't matter. But it did. Oh, it mattered more than he ever realized. Because that clause gave me one final hold over everything. The house had been sold. The money moved. But there was a trust, an account tied to the property, still legally in my name, untouched, overlooked by my brilliant son. He thought he had buried every detail, tied every loose end. But he missed that. And that was all I needed. The next morning, while the staff bustled in the hallways and my son went about his day smug and satisfied, I asked the nurse for a phone. She gave me a strange look, but she obliged. I dialed a number I hadn't called in years. My old lawyer. A man not as slick or polished as my son, but one who had loyalty, honesty, and above all, patience. When he answered, his voice warm and steady, I almost broke into tears. I explained everything slowly, carefully, my voice trembling. And then I heard him pause. "Ma'am, your son didn't tell you the full picture. You still have authority here. You still hold power he cannot touch." My heart skipped. I asked him what it meant, what I could do. And when he explained, a fire lit inside me. A fire I hadn't felt in years. All it would take was one call. One phone call to the right office, and my son's carefully woven net would unravel. The papers he had waved in my face, the arrogance with which he dismissed me, all of it would collapse. So I did it. I made that call. Calmly, quietly, with a steady hand. When I hung up, I felt lighter, stronger. For the first time since I was forced into that nursing home, I wasn't a victim. I wasn't helpless. I was in control. Days passed, and my son visited me, smug as ever, talking about investments, about how well things were going. I nodded, smiled, even thanked him. All the while, I knew the storm was coming. And when it came fast. One morning he stormed into the nursing home, face red, eyes wide. He slammed his briefcase on the table in front of me. "Mom, what did you do?" he demanded. I didn't answer right away. I just sipped my tea, calm, steady, letting his anger wash over me. "You undid everything. The accounts, the sales. Do you have any idea what you've done?" I looked at him, then really looked at him. My son, the boy I had raised, who once held my hand as we crossed streets, who once cried when he scraped his knee. And now, here he was. Not a boy but a man drunk on greed, furious that his scheme had slipped through his fingers. I set my cup down. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a blade. I did what any mother would do. I protected myself from a son who forgot his duty. His jaw clenched. He started to argue, to protest, but before he could, the phone rang. It was the court. The judge had reviewed the filings. The trust, the clause, the untouched account, it all stood firm. Legally, my son had no right to push me from my home, no authority to control those funds. The money was returned. The sale was reversed. And my son, my clever, arrogant son, stood there in shock, his entire world crumbling around him. The staff watched as his face paled, as his hands trembled. And I smiled. Because justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through the cracks, slips through the arrogance, and strikes when it's least expected. He thought he had caged me. He thought he had silenced me. But in the end, it was his pride that betrayed him. And as I sat there, sipping my tea in that sterile nursing home, I realized something. I wasn't weak. I wasn't finished. I was the woman who had built a family, raised children, endured storms. And no son, no lawyer, no matter how clever, could take that from me. The judge's shock, the unraveling of his scheme, the whispers of the truth spreading through the halls. It was the victory I never thought I'd see. And in that moment, I promised myself, never again would I let anyone mistake my silence for surrender. You know, the funny thing about victory is that it doesn't always feel the way you expect it to. When the judge's ruling came through, the staff in that nursing home whispered, the lawyers argued, and my son stood pale as chalk, unable to process what had just happened. But me. I just sat there in my chair, hands folded in my lap, heart beating steady. Because I knew something he didn't. Winning isn't always about the money. It isn't about property or accounts. Winning is about dignity. It's about showing those who counted you out that you are still very much alive, still thinking, still watching, still fighting. And that day I got my dignity back. The news spread quickly. Word travels fast in small circles. Some called me brilliant. Others called me stubborn. And some, well, they just shook their heads, saying an old woman had embarrassed her son in court. But here's the thing, I didn't care. What mattered was that I had shown him, and myself, that I wasn't helpless. I wasn't some fragile piece of glass to be handled and discarded. I was a mother, woman, a survivor. My son didn't take it well, of course. Oh, he raged. He tried to spin the story to say I was manipulated, that I didn't understand. But the law was clear, and the judge had spoken. His arrogance had cost him everything he thought he had stolen. For days he didn't visit me. Then weeks. Then months. The silence was heavy, but not unbearable. Because silence from someone who betrayed you isn't a punishment. It's freedom. And slowly, I realized something important. Maybe I had been holding on too tightly. Maybe I had wanted him to be the boy I raised, when in truth, he had chosen to become someone else. That wasn't my burden to carry anymore. The nursing home didn't feel like a prison anymore. Not after I knew I had choices. I didn't stay there long. My lawyer, the one who stood by me, helped me get my affairs in order. Soon enough, I was back in my own space where I belonged. And every corner of that space reminded me of who I was, of what I had endured. The garden where I once planted roses. The kitchen where I baked bread with flour dust in the air. The window where I watched thunderstorms roll in across the horizon. These weren't just walls. This was my story, my life, my proof that I had lived, fought, and survived. But here's the part I want you to listen to closely. It isn't just about my son. It isn't just about greed or betrayal or legal battles. It's about what happens when people underestimate you. See, the greatest weapon an old woman has isn't her money. It isn't her property. It's her wisdom. Because wisdom sees what arrogance blinds. Wisdom waits where impatience rushes. And wisdom strikes when no one is looking. There are nights I sit in my chair, tea steaming in my cup, and I wonder what might have been if my son had chosen differently. If he had remembered kindness instead of greed. If he had chosen care instead of control. But wondering doesn't change the truth. The truth is he betrayed me. And when he did, I found a strength I didn't know I still had. And that's the lesson I want anyone listening to take with them. Never let anyone write you off. Never let anyone tell you that your voice doesn't matter. Because no matter your age, your circumstances, or your scars, you have the power to stand tall, to fight back, and to protect your dignity. My son may still be angry. He may never forgive me. But I sleep soundly at night, knowing I didn't let him bury me alive in that nursing home. I fought. And I won. And when people whisper my story, I hope they don't just talk about the house or the money or the court case. I hope they remember that an old woman with nothing but memory and wisdom turned the tables on her own son. That's the story I want to leave behind. Because in the end, that's what survival looks like. Not just living, but living with dignity. And that's a victory no one can ever take away from me.